the wine that they used to sell, which was sherry. There was a part of France that sold. They manufactured wine, and they sold sherry, and they used to sell it. We're going to start from the Mishnah at the bottom of Einam and base, so moving back a lot.
Okay.
And they used to, when they would sell wine, that they, instead of selling it in bottles like we do nowadays, they would sell them these casks. And the manufacturers of Scotch in Scotland, they figured they have all these extra barrels. What are they going to do with them? So they figured they'll just use them to age their Scotch in. And what happened is eventually that was no longer practical, and even the French wine started to be shipped in bottles. And what happened is their sales dropped. The people who were selling Scotch, who were no longer using these extra barrels because they weren't getting those barrels anymore, because now they were getting their wine in bottles. So because of that, they had to just make regular oak casks. They made their own barrels to store their Scotch, to age their Scotch, but they got complaints. They actually lost customers and sales dropped because people noticed that the taste had changed. And it was at that point that they realized that there's a benefit to the taste of the sherry casks. So there are some manufacturers of Scotch went back to it. So it used to be all manufacturers of Scotch had sherry casks. Then most of the people moved away, and then some went back because of the feedback that they got from their clients that said that this tastes good.
So that's certainly a nice and Tom, right?
Oh, so it's definitely nice and Tom. So the famous shita on this is the shita of Reb Moshe. That Reb Moshe was matter sherry casks, but really Reb Moshe never discussed sherry casks. The shaila that came to Reb Moshe, interesting enough, came to Reb Moshe in 1948. So like Yidden that just got geshechted, and the Yidden in America are interested in how good their Scotch is going to be. Maybe after 48, they needed a Scotch because of all the tsuras they had to forget. So, and who brought the Shiloh to Rav Moshe? Of all people, Rav Pinchas Teitz. And Rav Pinchas Teitz wrote to Rav Moshe that I'm very proud that I accomplished something unbelievable, and that is that I was able to convince my oilam not to use sherry casks, or he was able to convince some manufacturers. I think that's what it was. He was able to convince some manufacturers that the Yidden were buying their booze to convert from the sherry casks and to use regular casks. So when Moshe got that, he responded to Pinchas Tatz, it's a great thing that you did, but I have to tell you, it wouldn't be a problem anyway. Why wouldn't it be a problem? Because Rav Moshe, I might be slightly messing up the question, because could be the question that was brought to Rav Moshe was actually not sherry casks. It was worse than that. It was that the manufacturers were putting in up to 2.5% of wine into the booze, right? That's what it was. That if they found out that they were putting up to 2.5% of wine into the booze, which is about 1 in 40, so it wouldn't even be bottled b'shishim, and that was the shaila that came to Rav Moshe, where actual wine was put in to the booze, and it was less than shishim, and that's the problem that Rav Pinchas Teitz had raised. So Rav Moshe told him it's not a problem, because of a Mefursha Shulchan Aruch that says that if wine, yain stam, is diluted by 1 to 6 parts water to 1 part wine, it loses its shem wine, and therefore there's no more isurim of stam yain on it at all. So 1 to 40 is more. So we always have this, but b'shishim, that's by all other products. But when it comes to wine, it loses its shem wine. It becomes a kiyua of alma, becomes like a little juice, like a plain juice, but it's not wine, and therefore there's no problem, even though there's actual wine mixed into the booze. So that was what Rav Moshe said. He never spoke about cask. Dairy cask should be even better than that, because all you have are the blias inside the cask. So there's 3 tshuvas that Rav Moshe wrote on it. They're printed in 3 consecutive tshuvas, because Rav Pinchas Tats, or Pinchas Tights, kept on bringing up reasons why it should be usher. But Rav Moshe writes, Bal Nefesh Yachmir, even though I'm being matter sherry casks, but a Bal Nefesh should be mach. He writes. And in the fears ois, however, when I go to a kiddush and they're serving booze that was made that had this sherry mixed into it, I would drink it. Why? Because I don't want the Chas Shalom being a matzah where people are giving each other l'chaim, and I shouldn't. So by all other places where Moshe is matir, and then he says Baal Nefesh Yachmer, he would never violate that. He would be the Baal Nefesh. But he said, and I'm also at home, I would never drink it. But if I'm at a public place and the oilam is drinking and the oilam is sitting and venting on each other l'chaim, I would also drink. That's what Moshe wrote. And that was even when they were mixing in 2% of sherry. So Frank had several different kashas. But the kasha that I want to bring up is the kasha that you brought up, is that if they're putting it in specifically for the taste, and obviously it's giving a taste, so they want to taste, right? A and B is, we know that something like spices, I feel about elephant bottle because it gives a little bit of taste, even though there's so much. So here clearly it gives a taste. Right, you see, it's noticed they lost their sales because it didn't have it. So you see, it still has its impact on the scotch. So why shouldn't that be a problem? Zokr Moshe, that would be a problem if it was wine that was impacting it. But once it's mixed into 6 parts water, yes, it's giving tasting, but it's not a dover also, it's giving taste. So therefore, there shouldn't be a problem. The other problem was the halach is ein mevatlan iser lechatchila. If you have iser, if it became bottle, then you're allowed to. But the lechatchila go be mevatlan iser, you're not allowed to do that. And here that's being done sort of lechatchila. So to Moshe, it's not being done lechatchila. Who are they doing it for? They're doing it for the big bad world out there. They're not doing it for you. They're doing it for the big bad world. So that's not called that it's being done for you, and that's not a concern of ein mevatlan iser lechatchila. There was a third kasha that the Pinchas asked that they asked from a Chuvash or Rashba, where the Chuvash or Rashba says, in his days, in medicine they used to mix in stam yayin, and Dr. Rashba, even though normally it will be bottled, but if they're putting it in special for the medicine, because they want it in there, then that it also wouldn't be bottled. So a Pinchas asks from that. I didn't get the exact tshuva for that. But according to Moshe, sherry casks is no problem. And even though if the oilam is drinking and they're enjoying together and they're avenging each other on the chaim together, he shouldn't turn himself away. But Moshe himself, I myself would drink under those conditions. So that's the sugya of sherry casks. Okay, Zok the Heilige Mishnah. Now, I don't like the way the Art Scroll pronounces this word. There's an Art Scroll pronounces this word as boileshes. I think it's a bullshit. But whatever the case is, they're an army, they're a marauding army that will answer anything in their path. So what happens if they came into the city and it was a peaceful time? So the halacha is they have time to ruin people's wine. Therefore, any open barrels that you find will be also, you have to assume the guy touched them, put his hand in them, and want to go mishes around with the wine, it becomes also. But Sasumash, if they're sealed barrels, then mutaris, because we learned a sealed barrel, even if they shake it, that doesn't make it into yainesa. But b'shas milchama, if they're under pressure, they're being pursued by an enemy or they're pursuing an enemy, they don't have time to start playing with people's wine. So then elu be'elu mutaris, even open barrels will assume where's mutar, levisha ein p'nai l'nasech. Even if they opened up the barrel, they definitely didn't have time to make ya'inesach out of it, to shake it around l'shem ha'vayizar. Frank Gemara, are you telling me that they don't have time when they're rushing because they're in war? They have plenty time. You know why? Because in Romania we learned Irsha Kavshua Karku. If there was a city that was overrun by people who were besieging them, this is in a live war. You have to assume that every woman in the city was violated, and therefore any woman who was married to a kohen, kohen here means married to a kohen. We know an Ashes kohen shenen says osir. So all of the women Rahman Watzon who were married to kohanim are now osir to their husbands, because the assumption is that they were violated. How do they have time to be violating women? They're running for their lives. They're in the middle of a war. Rav Mori, everything has its proper place. L'nasachen p'nai. For Nisach Hayayin, for avoid the Zor, for the Getchke they don't have time, they're busy fighting a war. A Belibel, to fulfill their tithes, for that there's plenty of time, even in a war, Yesh Pinai. And therefore, there's a concern about the women, but there wouldn't be a concern about the wine.
What about would they be mutter to marry psulos or psulos before they came? In other words,
If they were
it
violated
should be
by
all
Goyim,
women.
they're considered Zaynas. A woman who is novelized by someone who's Pasala is a Zayna, and
So they can't remarry any woman in the town
why can't they marry?
if they're considered Zionists.
Yeah, the Kaihanim will no longer be able to marry anyone in that town. They'll have to find somebody from a different town. Yeah, but they still get Kohen. Okay, Dr. Gemara. Imagine a guy, a Jewish person is employed by a guy, and let's say he's owed $700 for his wages, and instead of getting a check, he got a barrel of wine. Now that barrel of wine is Asher B'nah. So the Yid, if he rejects it and never accepts it, and says, no, you got to pay me cash for my work, that's fine. But what if the Yid accepts the bottle of wine? And then they say, you know what, can I give it back to you and you'll give me cash? Then it's usher because they're having a no from the wine, because they're swapping in the wine. To reject it and to demand cash for their work, they're not having a no from the Ayin Nesach. But once they accepted it already, now it's theirs. So when they're giving it back to get cash, that's going to be a problem. Let me read them around. A person can tell a guy, say face a lie, Menashe Melech. In those days, they had income tax as well. So, but it was not paid in cash normally. So if you produced a certain amount of wheat, you had to give 10% of that to the CRA. Are you Canadian or are you American?
IRS, basically, right?
Oh, so the IRS. So for you, it would be the IRS. And if you're a dual citizen, you have to give it to the CRA and to the IRS.
Yes.
Okay. And if someone produced animals, for instance, so then he would have to give 10% of that. Well, what if this Yid produced wine? So now he has to give 10% of his wine to the CRA. So what will he do? He'll tell the guy, do me a favor. You take care of the tax man. I'll already pay you back. You're allowed to do that. Even though what's going to happen is the guy is going to give his guy, his friend, is also a wine producer. He's going to give Yayin Nesach to the king, and then the Yid is going to pay him for that. So come to the Yid is paying him for his Yayin Nesach. That's going to be a problem. Zok Rabbi Yehuda Marav, it's not a problem. He can say Menashe Melech, and the reason why he could do that is because I didn't ask him to give wine. If he would have wanted to pay off the IRS in cash, they would have taken the money in lieu of the product. So he on his own decided to give product. That's not where he's representing me, because to represent me, all he had to do was give cash. Therefore, I could pay him for doing that, because we don't look at it like he is giving Yayin Nesach for me. Frank Gemara Meisvei, we have a similar case that's outlawed. It says, Al yomer adam lo'evit kechavim oil tachti lo'itzer. A person should not tell a guy, go take my place in dealing with the taxman. There it should be the same thing. Omer lei, Rav said there's no comparison. Oil tachti lo'itzer kamer. There, what I'm telling you is be my shliach mamish. And what you do should be considered like I did it. That's not allowed. What I allow is similar to the second case of the Brisa that you quoted. And that is, although you're not allowed to say oil tachti, you are allowed to tell a guy, malteni min ha'oiter. Protect me from the oiter, protect me from the taxman. In other words, pay them off for me. That you're allowed to do, because there you're not giving Yayin Nesach in my request as my representative. As my representative, you're just paying them off. Whatever you decide to give them is your business. The next sugya actually is a sugya that really doesn't belong here in Avoda Zara. It's discussing kinyonim and which kinyonim work to transfer a product either from a yid to a goy if a yid is selling it to a goy, or from a goy to yid if the goy was selling it to a yid. So, if you're selling wine to a goy, you need to be very, very cautious, because you have to make sure that before the goy is able to touch the wine, he owns the wine. Because if he touches the wine before he owns it, then he actually made your wine into Isser Hana, and now you cannot accept payment from him. So you got to make sure that the guy owns the wine before he can touch it. So therefore, Pasach, if you made up, you're going to charge him $5 a gallon, actually mudad, but before you measured it out. Now the way they used to do it is the Yid would have a cup, a bowl, a jar, or something in his store. The guy would say, "I'd like to buy wine from you." So he would take his big jug and he would pour into the jug. Let's say he wanted a gallon, so he'd fill up a gallon. The guy would take that jug and pull it to him, right? At that point, there's the conversion of ownership, because that's called a kinyan mashicha. As soon as the guy makes that kinyan mashicha, boom, it's the guy's. Now, if the guy touches it after that point, there's no concern, because once the guy pulls it, he was kind of the wine b'mashicha, which triggers a chiyuv for him to now pay the yid the money that they decided upon, which would be the payment for that wine. Even if he didn't pay it, it doesn't matter, because once he took ownership of the wine, he took ownership of kosher wine, and now he becomes mechuyev to pay the yid the $10 on behalf of the kosher wine that he received. Now, if the guy after that point makes that wine into Israel, that's not the Jew's business. So if they had already made up the price, and then he did this Mashicha. So I'm substituting the word Mashicha for Modad, even though Modad means literally measuring it, but the net product of that is that there is a Mashicha, so I'm just going to call it a Mashicha. Modad will be the Kinyan Mashicha. Dam of Mutarin, the Jew is allowed to accept payment for the wine because the wine that the Goy bought from him was not Isser Hana. However, what if it was Modad? What if it was Modad Achalei Pasach? When he pulled the Keilah to himself, they had not yet made up the price. So therefore, there's no kinyan yet. There's no kinyan yet. The kinyan will only be once we make up the price and the guy pays, then it's of Surin. Because now the guy is paying for wine that he already has in his possession that he likely touched. That's Isra Noah. It became Isra Noah while it still belonged to the Yid. The Yid's not allowed to accept any money. Omar Meimar. Zokta Meimar. Meshicha ba'ovet chavim koin. A guy could be koin with kinyan Meshicha. Because we're going to learn that there's a pasuk that Rabbi Yochanan analyzes. The machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish how to analyze this pasuk. But it says v'chisimkru memkar lamisecha economy amisecha, and we learn the kinyan that works for amisecha, the kinyan that works for a yid, will not work for a goy, and the kinyan that works for a goy will not work for a yid. And there's a machlokes what kinyan works for a goy. So Rabbi Yochanan learns that it's kinyan kesef that works for a yid, and for a guy it would be kinyan Mashiach. So Amar Meimer Mashiach by Chav Mekaina. Kesef is koina by a yid, not by a guy, and Mashiach is koina by a guy. Teda, how do I know that? Now we have a raya from our Mishnah, because the case of our Mishnah that we just learned, if it was Modad, it was Pasach, and then it was Modad, as soon as the guy made a Mashiach, we say that the wine transferred into his possession. So our Mishnah, right off the bat, seems to be a raya that Mashiach is koina by a guy. But that's going to be under discussions. Teda, how do I know that, in fact, Mashiach is koina by a guy? Because Persians send gifts to each other. The ArtScroll teaches it as bribes. And after the recipient makes a Mashiach, they don't back out. They consider that an irrevocably closed deal. So you see that Mashiach is koina. So the first question that everyone asks is, because Persians do it, that means halachically it's called opinion. So for that, we have to take a quick peek into Tosfos. Amar Amemar, this is the Tosfos that transitions from the skinny lines to the wide lines. Amar Amemar Mashiach b'v'tichav mukana teda nani persoi mishadi pashtoni adodi v'adrabu. Oimari the ain't ikar time. That's not the real reason for it. Ella mishum da Amemar savar Rabbi Yochanan and Amemar was like Rabbi Yochanan. Damar ma'is kainais v'darish la'amisecha bekesef but lo v'tichavim b'mashicha. Zok Tosfos u'mashemevi raya mipardashani de parsoi. It's not really a raya. It's just an example. It's like a story that sort of supports it. There's a minig by the Persians, they will never be chayzer. They consider a deal irrevocable after the Mashiach is done. So Shema Min Hashkachadim, that sort of supports the fact that that's the way it is. Now, what are these Parshdoni? So there's actually two Lashonis from Rashi. One Lashon is that is bribes given to a king, which is Matana. There's another Lashon that it means during a Mekach Memkar. And Rashi says, Tosfos explains, that surely the second shot is right, that it was a Mekach Memkar that they're discussing, not a Matana. You know why? Because the whole Shaila of if Mashiach is Koina or Kesef is Koina by a Goy is only by a transaction where there's a transfer of Kesef, like a Mekach Memkar. When I'm selling something, it might become irrevocable by the Mashiach, or it might become irrevocable by paying the money. But if it's a matana, if I'm giving you a gift, or if it's a mitzvah, if you find something on the ground, the guy finds something on the ground where there is no money changing hands, there everybody agrees Mashiach is kind of by a guy. The whole question of if a Mashiach is kind of by a guy is by a transaction where there's payment. Okay, so Dr. Gemara Viter. Rabashi disagreed with Hamemar, and he says, Mashiach is not kind. You see the Persians have a tremendous big deal. You can't bring her out from their bidding. They have a certain pride. We're honest. We stick to our deals, but not because halachically it's technically an irrevocable deal after the Mashiach. Now, the first question that'll have to pop up in our minds is how is Rabashi going to understand our Mishnah? Our Mishnah seems to say that Modad is what transfers the ownership. The Mashiach transfers the ownership. That's going to be one of the kashas that the Gemara is going to ask, but the Gemara has several other kashas. Amar Ravashi, Mina Aminallah. How do I know? Where did I get this from? That Mashiach does not work by a far goy. Rav was giving advice to wine merchants, and the advice that he gave them was, when you are going to pour the wine for the goyim as you're serving them the wine, like in our Mishnah's case, when you're pouring it into the kalim, make sure shaklu zuzu minayu v'hadachaylu. First, make sure they pay. So you were paid before they even got near the wine, and you were paid for kosher wine. Because v'loy, what if v'loy nikitu ba'adayu zuzi? What if they didn't bring money? So maybe say, okay, we can't do it. No, insist that they have the money. What should you do? Oizu pinu. Instead of selling them the wine on credit, lend them the cash. Take the cash out of your pocket and lend them the cash that they need to buy your wine. Let them pay you for the wine. So now that the wine is paid for before they get it, they happen to owe you an independent choiv because now they borrowed money from you. But as far as the wine transaction is concerned, they paid you in advance of receiving the wine. This way, the money that they owe you is just halva. It's not related to the purchase of the wine. If you don't do this, Rav warned these merchants, it will become yain nesach when it's still in your possession. And therefore, when they pay later, after they did the Mashiach and they touch the wine, the chishakiltu, when you take money, the may yain nesach kashakiltu. You're accepting money for your yain nesach. Zokt Rabashi, if Mashiach is kaina, so in the Mishnah case, it's perfect. Let him first make the Mashiach. It's his already. If he touches the wine afterwards, it's not a problem, and let him pay you later. So that was Ravashi's kind. If you hold Mashiach is koina by a guy, turning over on Talmud Beis, as soon as the guy made the Mashiach, he was koined, just as our Mishnah states, and yayin nesach lehabe adenagabe. It doesn't become yayin nesach till a later point where the guy actually touches it, but at that point it's the guy's wine, and the guy could still pay the yid for wine that he acquired through the Mashiach, because at the time of the Mashiach, it was not yayin nesach. Elamai, it must be that Mashiach is not koina. And since Mashiach is not koina, Rav said you better take the cash first. Zok Gemara, you don't have a right. Let's say Rav holds that Mashiach is koina. So why was he concerned that you should take the money first? I'll tell you why. Because the minig of the merchants that Rav was warning would not have been able to take advantage of Mashiach. Why? Because if the Yid was pouring wine into the Yisrael's kalim, you're right, there would have been a Mashiach, it would have been koina, and there wouldn't have been an issue with taking pay for it. Hachanami. The problem is they used to pour the wine into the goy's kalim. What's wrong with the goy's kalim? The goyim didn't bring their kalim squeaky clean. The goyim brought their kalim in that had a little bit of wine at the bottom. yain nesach at the bottom. So the problem isn't whether he was kohen or not. The problem isn't when he touched the wine, because touching the wine is not relevant. The moment his wine goes into the kalim of the goyim and it touches and it mixes with the yain nesach over there, it becomes osir. I'm sorry? Batal b'shishim does not work for Israel. No, batal b'shishim does not work for Israel. The problem of Israel, no one's discussing drinking it. The question is, can you accept the money for it? Right? So hachanami loy tzricha. I don't want to offend you, but that's what people do about that. Sagt the Gemara, hachanami loy tzricha dekachayil verami lemonad. The wine, I'm sorry, is being poured into the keli there that has yain nesach. So frankly, so what's the problem? I don't understand. He was still kohen it before. Soif ki kamata. So let's play out the scenario in our minds. The guy comes with his container, right? And the yid, and it has a little bit of grape juice, it has a little bit of wine on the bottom, and the yid pours his wine from his barrel into the guy's container, right? So what's the problem? That it can become yain nesach when it hits the bottom of his container, but as the wine is poured into his container, the moment the wine is already within the airspace of his container, even before it hits the bottom, it already becomes the guy. The guy is kanyit back boy. He's holding onto the keli. So soisav kimata lavira demana kanya. When is the guy kanyit? While it's still in the airspace, and at that point he becomes mechuyev. The trigger to pay is there, and the trigger to pay is to pay for wine that has no problem. Yayin nesach will have it. It doesn't become yayin nesach ad the mati lar isay demana until it actually hit the floor. Now, people always know. Most people are very familiar with a slow motion play by play that you often when you're watching sports, and if there's a close call, they'd also play back in slow motion. You know where they got it from? They got it from this Gemara. If you play back in slow motion, you'll see that first the wine was in the air of the keli. At that point, there was a kinyan, and it's an irrevocable kinyan, and the guy becomes mechuyev to pay the yid for the wine, which is beautiful kosher wine. And then a nanosecond later, in the next frame, is where it hits and touches the wine that's already in the keli and becomes osir. So now, if Rav is worried that this should be a problem, let's think about it. Why would it be a problem? Once it's in the keli, it was already nikna, we're saying, right? So what could be the problem? The problem could be is very simple. If I'm pouring from my keli into his container, there could be 12 inches of stream here, right? Out of the 12 inches of stream, the first 6 inches is already inside the walls of his keli, and that he was kohen at first. So that will not become osir. But what about the stream that's not in his keli yet? That still belongs, it's still in midair. It's not within the walls of his keli. That still belongs to the Jew. But since it's connected to the stream that's touching the goyish wine, boom, that becomes osir in midair. So Zok to Gemara, if Rav made this warning, Rav was concerned, he must hold that nitzuk chibur, he must hold that the whole stream is osir. And we're going to learn we're going to learn today, hopefully, if I catch up, that there's a very big shayla of nitzuk is chibur. There's shittas, I think, Tosus passes nitzuk is ena chibur. So, are you telling me that Rav is wading in to a big discussion that maybe that can have a huge impact if we know what he holds? So, Shemamina nitzuk chibur. Are you telling me that Rav is taking a stand in the shayla of nitzuk chibur? But it's too late. So you tell me what Rav could have said, just rinse out the container. Why did Rav say take the money first? Because Rav's cheshbon is be safe. If you have the money, then no matter what he did, if he cleaned it out, if he didn't clean it out, you got to play it safe to protect your money. So Zok to Gemara, Shemami Nanitzah Chibur Zok Merloi. No. Eden Noket le'oivit k'chavim l'chli b'yadei hachanam. If the guy was holding the keli in his hand, right? That was the scenario. He was holding his keli, and he poured the wine into it. We say nitzuk ein chibur. So if nitzuk ein chibur, once again, what's Rav's concern about? There's no concern. The guy is koina the wine before it hit the bottom of the keli. So why was Rav concerned? I'll tell you why Rav is concerned. The manach ara, because the guy wasn't holding the keli. The keli was sitting on the ground. Therefore, if the guy is holding the keli, then he will be koina the wine as it comes into the airspace of the keli. But if the keli is sitting on the ground, then the keli will not be koina for the guy. So the wine's going into the keli, he's pouring it into the guy's keli. It's going into the guy's keli, never changing ownership, even though it's in the guy's keli. It touches the wine of the guy inside the keli, becomes usher, and there still was not a change of ownership. I don't understand. It's like kela. If it's the guy's keli and you poured it into his keli, even though it's in your store, but it's in his keli, let his keli be kind for him, just like his chotzer could be kind for him. Now, if Rav is concerned, it must mean that Rav holds that the kalim of a person is not kind for him if those kalim are in the store owner's rishos. And that's also a big controversy, and we never knew that Rav waded into this controversy. So now we're back to square one. What was Rav concerned about? If he'd measured it into his own keli and the guy's pulling the keli, you have Mashiach, because you hold Mashiach's kind. If it's a question of wine that's in the bottom of the guy's keli, well, there's no kinyan here. So we want to say that there is a kinyan, and it's a kinyan chibur. So why in the world would the wine become us? Zakt Gemara le'olam emalach kandalakeh. You know why Rav was concerned? Is because the goyim in those days had kalim that had a big rim around them, right? They had a big rim around them. Imagine, coffee cups today, they come with a cover, right? And let's say you wanted to fill the coffee cup with the cover on. What would you do? You would pour wine into the cover, it would linger there in the cover, and then it would drip down into the coffee cup, right? That's exactly the type of jugs that the goyim came with to buy wine. The kaznusa. Now, the problem is, even if the keli of the guy will be kaina, it will only be kaina when the wine is actually within the walls of the keli. When it's just in the rim, there's no kinyan yet. But the rim is still dirty with the guy's wine. So when the Jewish wine goes into the rim, it becomes aser, but the guy won't be kaina until it gets into the actual barrel. And therefore, Zok Rab, you're going to have a problem. It'll become yayin netach before the guy's kaina it, and you will not be able to accept payment for it. Therefore, I suggest you make sure to collect payment before you start dishing out the wine. The kama incichle. So Zok Gemara, after all is said and done, Dovi brought up a question. Why did you say it's butter? Right? Now we learned that if I have wine, nice kosher wine, I have a barrel that has 60 gallons of kosher wine in it, and someone spills in 5 gallons of non-kosher wine, right? We had a Gemara. What do you do with that wine? So we had a Gemara. And the Reb Shimon Gamliel told us, not a problem. You could sell it to any guy, but you're not going to charge him for 65 gallons of wine. You're only going to charge him for 60 gallons of wine, the kosher part of the wine. So if you hold like Reb Shimon Gamliel, then Rav's whole concern is nothing. Because what do I care if my wine then touches his wine? So I'm not drinking it. I'm still allowed to sell it to the guy, because the guy's not paying me for his own wine, that's the Yain Nesek. He's paying me for my wine, which your wine is mixed into. According to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that's not even a concern at all. So Zok Gemara Chaman, if Rav had this concern, it must be the loiker Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. It must be that Rav argues with Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. The Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, whenever you have a mixture of stam yain together with kosher wine, you're allowed to sell that. You just only charge for the kosher wine and not for the non-kosher wine. And of course, you're only going to sell it to a guy. So the Gemara says it must be that Rav argues with Reb Shimon Gamliel. Zok Gemara, you're right. Rav. We're talking about Rav over here. This whole thing is based on Rav's warning to the merchants who sell wine. Well, guess what? Rav also agrees to a certain level of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel's kula, and that is if I have 500 barrels of wine in my warehouse, and 3 barrels show up in my warehouse by a goy that are yain nesach, but you have no idea which ones these barrels are. There, even Rav agrees you could sell all the barrels, but you'll only charge for the kosher barrels. But yain b'yain, if you had 1 barrel that goyish wine got mixed two in the same barrel, there Rav doesn't like Reb Shimon Gamliel's plan, and there he holds it's a problem. And it's for that reason that Rav warned the merchants to take the cash before they pour the wine. But if you hold like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel fully, even that wouldn't be a problem, because he would be allowed to sell it in. So we've just neutralized a kasha on the memar. We thought we would have a proof from Rav's warning to the merchants that the Mashiach is not kaina. In fact, the Gemara says Rav could very well hold Mashiach is kaina. The concern was a completely different concern. Basically, now we're going to have another kasha to try to prove that Mashiach is not koina, which will be a kasha on a Meimar who said Mashiach is koina, and it'll be a proof to support Rav Ashi. And this was a case that we know very well because we had it once before. Someone's buying scrap silver pieces from a goy. So he buys a big box full of small scraps. He probably buys them by the pound. And as he's going through the scrap pieces, he found in there a little idol, a little getchke. Now he says, this is usher banah to me. What am I going to do with it? I can't afford to lose the weight of this getchke. If he didn't pay it, even though he made a kinyan Mashiach, Yachzer is allowed to give it back. Now that's proof right over here that Mashiach is not koina. Because if Mashiach was koina, doesn't make a difference if he paid yet. The fact that he made Mashiach made the sale irrevocable. Now it's his getchke. Yet, what does this brisa say? If he didn't pay, even though he made Mashiach, he could give it back. So that seems to indicate quite clearly that Mashiach is not koina. But if he already paid by the time he took the getchke, then there's no eitzah for him. He has to throw the getchke to Yam Melech. He has to take a loss. Zok the Gemara. If Mashiach is koina, well then the Mayachzer in the ratio of this brisa, how could the Yid give it back to the goy? It's already his. Amar Abaye, because there's a whole new set of rules. Mishum de mechza ki mekachtos. The halach is even if you make a bona fide kinyan, if it's a mekachtos, and the entire kinyan was made under false pretext, even if you marry a woman and she turns out being an idleness, even that's a mekachtos, and the kedushin is null and void, right? The strongest, best kinyan, if it's made under false pretenses, it will be null and void. So of course the Mashiach is a good Mashiach. Why can he give it back? Because it's a mekachtos. So for the Gemara, I'm a Rava, Reisha mekachtos, safe a lot mekachtos. If it's a mekachtos, so what's the difference if he paid already? It's still a mekachtos. He should be able to reverse the sale. I'm a Rava, Reisha v'seif mekachtos. Me'ikar adin, Avoda should be able to give it back because the sale never got completed. The difference between the Reisha and the Seifa is Reisha lo yoav zuzi, and therefore le mischazi kavoid kachavim biyad yisrael. In the Reisha, I never paid. All I'm doing is giving back the getchke, but you're not giving me. The guy's not giving me money because I never paid yet. That doesn't look bad. But Seifa the yoav zuzi mischazi kavoid kachavim biyad yisrael. If when the yid gives back the getchke, then the guy has to refund him cash to someone looking. It looks like the yid is selling a getchke to a guy. Al-Tamara sign is prohibited, but Ma'ikadin is not prohibited. Now we're going to bring rise the other way. Now we're going to bring rise that Mashiach is kohen. From our Mishnah. Our Mishnah. Once you made the Mashiach, once the guy made the Mashiach on the wine, there's no problem anymore. That means Mashiach must be kohen. Why in the world would the money be mutter? There was never a kinyan made. It's just because the guy made a Mashiach, that doesn't have any validity if you hold Mashiach is not claimed. Zok to Gemara, there's a very important piece of information missing from the Mishnah. Now the guy didn't know how much it was going to cost. So the guy, let's say, thinks it's going to cost anywhere between $10 and $30. So we gave the Yid before this whole transaction, here's $50. And once we figure out how much it costs, you'll already refund me the extra change. But it was paid for in advance. So if it was paid for in advance, there was a kinyan kesef. So, correct the Gemara, if it's speaking that there was a kinyan kesef in advance of everything, if it was paid for in advance, there's a kinyan already. What's the difference? Why it is an aser? Am I davam of surim? Rav Ashi answered it back. You're not working with a prepayment. You're working with a kinyan mashicha. You have the same problem. Amai Reisha Dama Mutar and Veseva Dama Basurim. The same question you're asking on me, if there was a kinyan, why is the money usher? That kasha goes right back at you. How are you going to learn? Why is it usher? Elamai Lachlemever. How are you going to be forced to explain the Mishnah? Hasak Sam Chadaite. If in advance of the Mashiach, we had already made up it's going to be $5 a gallon. So then when I make the Mashiach, I have a intention to be mechayiv himself irrevocably. But loy pasak, if we never made up the price, loy sam chadaite. Even if I make a bona fide kinyan like a Mashiach, I don't really have kavanah to be koina, because how could I be koina something if I don't even know what its price tag is yet? So therefore, the loy pasak nullifies the sale. So that explanation that you're going to give to nullify the Mashiach, because you hold a Mishnah works with Mashiach, I who hold it works with Kinyan Kesef have the same Mashita. L'didinami. Avagav the Kodim lay dinner, even though he paid in advance. Pasak som chadaite. If the price was made up, then the guy has kavod to be koina. But loy pasak loy som chadaite, because he's not going to buy something without knowing the price. Now they say that if you go to a rebbe, like in Tosh, I used to go to Tosh for Yom Kippur. If they sell aliyahs and you buy an aliyah, so then you know how much you're paying for it, how much you bid. But in Tosh, if they give you an aliyah and you didn't buy it, then it's going to be expensive. You never should buy something unless you know its price tag before you buy it. So Amalei Ravina Ravashi Toshma. Now the Gemara is going to have a decisive raya that's going to prove our point. Ben Noach Nerg al Pachos Mishav Pruta. A guy who steals from a yid, even less than the Shavar Pruta, is Chayiv Misa. Because a guy is Mechuyev, even on Pachos Mishav Pruta, because to a guy that's called a Dover Choshev. To a yid is not called Dover Choshev, but a guy it is. And we know.
Here, no, that's what the English says.
Yeah. And a guy also is Chayiv Misa for any violation of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Even without Eidim, even without Ashra, a guy is Chayiv Misa. So if a guy steals less than the Shavar Pruta from a yid, he's Chayiv Misa. And V'lolit Nishavin, and there's no way he could be the Kayim Veishav or Success. Practically more. The Arvat Mashiach by the Kav Meina Kaina. If the old Mashiach is not Kaina, so when a guy steals, he's not really doing anything. It's like he's moving the Jews' possession from point A to point B, but it always belongs to the yid. He's relocating it, but he's not stealing. Stealing means he's Kaina. But since he can't be Kaina by Mashiach, so a guy could never be over the violation. Why would he be Chayiv Mitzvah? He didn't do anything. Am I there? Dr. Mar, you know why he gets killed? Mishum the Tzari Li Yisrael. You're right. The Chayiv Mitzvah isn't because he transferred possessions out of the Jews' rishus. He's getting killed because he hurt the Jew. He's causing him pain. Okay, Dr. Mar, what does it mean? He doesn't have a chiv to pay back. He never took it. How could he pay back something that he didn't take? Dr. Mar, yeah, that's exactly what it means. It's impossible for him to give back something that he never was kind in the first place. Zok to Gemara, but the Seifa is the clincher. If we look at the Seifa, this brisa with the guy stealing from a yid, the Seifa goes on. What if now another guy came and stole it from the first guy? The second guy also nergala, because the second guy violated Gzela. The problem is, the first guy gets killed because he caused pain to the Jew. But the second guy who stole it from the first guy, he didn't cause any pain to the Jew. Ela Seifa, my oven. What did the guy do? That's Machayiv Misa. If he wasn't kainit, he really didn't do anything. Ela Shemami no, Meshicha ba'ovid gechavim kainit Shemami no. So this is a proof positive that Meshicha is kainit by a guy, because a guy gets killed for stealing, even Pachas Mishava Pruta, Shemami no, that Meshicha is kainit, and that's how the Gemara comes out. The only problem is at the beginning of the Sugya, Tosfos told us that the whole discussion about Meshicha is a Meshicha in a case where there's an exchange of money, like a sale. By stealing, there is no exchange of money. So what's the riot? The Tosfos says, by matana, by mitzia, which beheter asli yodei, the guy who's taking it is taking it beheter. There, yes, Meshicha alone works. But when he's stealing from somebody, the Gemara holds that that's not like picking up a matana mitzia. That should be comparable to mekach member. Now we're going to be focusing on the halacha of if we don't make up a price in advance, we can't possibly say that I agree to a sale. Right? That's what we just had with the wine in our Mishnah. So someone told his friend, I have a piece of property. I know you're dying to buy my property. So let me tell you right now. If I ever sell this property, I'm only going to sell it to you. But he didn't just say that. They made a kinyan. The friend made a kinyan. Right now, we made a kinyan. We made a kinyan kesef, shtar, chazaka. We made a legitimate kinyan that would work. And I said, if at any time in the future I want to sell it, lemafreya, from the time of the kinyan today, you're coined it already. So we're making the kinyan now. Almanas that sometime in the future I should be willing to sell it. Should I be willing to sell it anytime in the future? It's going to trigger that the kinyan that we're making today will be chal. And what did the guy do? He went back on his word. He sold the property to a third party. Rabbi Yosef Kana Kama. It doesn't matter. The first kinyan that was made was legit, and the guy we sold it to doesn't get it. It gets sold to the first person who made a kinyan of it. Omer Labaye, but Abaye asked for pasuk. Of course, but Frank the Bible pasuk. They never made up a price.
Right.
So how could you say it's a good kinyan if they never made up a price? And technically, even if I made such a kinyan, it's not valid on its face, because I can, if I decide that I don't want to sell it to you, I can jack up the price to some exorbitant price, and then you won't buy it. So therefore, how could this possibly be a binding kinyan? How do I know that if they didn't make up a price, the kinyan wouldn't be good? Ditnan our very Mishnah. They're dumb of mutarin. That madad actually pasuk dumb of asurim. So you see bam yayin nesach that if they didn't make up the price, no kinyan could be valid. Zok Gemara, my havilah. So Lamai said, what's halacha? Frank Gemara, what do you mean what's halacha? My havilah kidei kamrina. We just proved to you from a Mishnah that if you didn't make up the price, the kinyan is not valid. Zok Gemara, maybe you can't be arrived from yayin nesach. Dilma chumer de yayin nesach shine. Maybe we're so machmer in yayin nesach that if you didn't make up the price, we won't consider it sold. We'll consider it yayin nesach in the hands of the Jew. But in a regular case of mekach memkar, maybe it would still be a kinyan. So we can't be arrived from yayin nesach. So Tashma, I'll bring the right by a different place. There was a story that happened by Rav Chisda where someone made just this type of deal and they didn't make up the price. Rav Chisda by Rav Huna, and Rav Chisda went to the Bismedish of Rav Huna to discuss this shaila, and they were able to prove it from the following case. That none. What happens if someone's selling me product? So he's delivering to me produce, and who's delivering it? His truck driver has it in a knapsack, or his workers have it in a knapsack, and they come to my house and they're carrying this produce. And I go and I drag these people into my house. So I don't unload them and take the product into my house. I drag the people that are holding the produce into my house. So that is not a kinyan. Mashiach is only on the product itself, not on the person who's holding the product. Therefore, it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference if they made up the price yet. Because there's no valid kinyan. And therefore, either party could back out of the deal if they don't want to go through with it. But if he unloaded them from the people who were carrying them, and he made a meshicha or a kinyan chotzer on the actual produce, then it depends if they made up a price. If they had already made up a price, then it's irrevocable. Then ain't shneim yichayim lachshaben. But modad actually pasak, then shneim yichayim lachshaben, because since they didn't make up the price, the sale has zero validity. Okay, we'll stop here. We're still we're 3/4 of a block behind. So tomorrow, I'm gonna start learning probably an hour and a half before mincha, because we have to finish Daf Ayin Beis, and we have to finish Daf Ayin Gimel tomorrow. So
okay.
yeah, because today's blot was really Ayin Beis, but I slept in yesterday and I didn't show up. It's the first time I slept in. Yeah, it's the first time I slept in.